Hello and welcome to another Bard's Tale. This week's collection of Chinese folktales is a little darker than the usual moral tales. Ghosts, ogres, and living corpses, these tales tell of people who have brushed with the strange and supernatural in ancient China. Long ago, south of the Yangtze Kiang, lived a man preparing to be a teacher in Suchao Fu, on the border of Shantung. He travelled there only to find the schoolhouse had not yet been finished, and so he went to the two-story building rented out for his use as a home and a temporary school. The house was outside the village, not too far from the river bank. A broad plain overgrown with tangled brush spread out in all directions. The soon-to-be teacher appreciated the view. One evening while he was enjoying the sunset from his doorway, and smoke began to rise from the village chimneys, and the noises of the day faded away, a fiery gleam in the fading light caught his eye. The light came from the river bank, and so he made his way down the slope towards it. Upon the bank of the river he came across a wooden coffin. The teacher, being well educated, made a guess that within the coffin were jewels that shine by night, as was the custom. This awoke a vicious greed within him, and he picked up a large stone and smashed the coffin's lid open. To his dismay and fear, he found no jewels, only the corpse of a youth whose face was white as paper. The dead man wore a mourning turban, as was the custom when the young died before their parents. He was also wrapped in hempen garments and wore sandals on his feet. The teacher was terrified and turned to leave when suddenly the corpse sat up. The teacher ran, feet hard on the ground, thankful that his house was so close. The corpse climbed out of the coffin and ran after him. The teacher reached the house, flew up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and locked it. He stood still, finally catching his breath. He could not hear anything from outside the door, and assumed the corpse had quit, and let him be. Curiosity got the better of him, however, as he opened the window to see if he could spot the not-so-dead corpse. This was a mistake on his part, however, because the corpse was leaning on the wall below. Once the window had been fully opened, the corpse leapt up to the windowsill and crawled inside the room. Overcome by terror, he made for the door, only to fall down the stairs, crumpling unconscious in a heap once he hit the floor. Strangely, once he lost consciousness, at that precise moment, the corpse too collapsed on the floor above, not to move again. Since there were no school children at the time, and the owner lived away from the house, no one found him till the next day. The school children found the door locked, and no one answered their calls. They broke down the door, concerned for their teacher, and found him still unconscious on the floor. They sprinkled him with ginger, but still it took quite some time for him to awake from his coma. When finally he awoke, he told them all of what had happened. They all went upstairs to find the corpse, quite dead this time, laying on the floor. The body was taken outside the village limits and burned. The bones which remained were returned to the coffin and laid to rest. The teacher thought on what had happened and realized that a moment's greed could easily, and almost had, cost him his life. After this, he resigned from his position, returned to his home, and never, throughout all his life, thought or spoke of gain again. There once was an old Buddhist monk who lived in Fu. He loved to wander into lonely places, and on one of his wanderings he came to the great lake Kuku-no. There he saw a tree which was 1,000 feet high and very wide in breadth. The tree was hollow, and the monk could see the light of the sky shining through from within. He travelled around the lake for many miles, till he saw in the distance a girl in a red coat, barefoot, and with wild, unbound hair. She was running fast as the wind, and in but a moment she stood before him. She begged him for pity, to save her life. The monk was confused, and asked what her trouble was. She claimed a man was pursuing her. She would be grateful for all her life if the old monk would not mention that he had seen her. With that she ran to the hollow of the tree, and crawled inside. The monk was stunned for a moment, but continued on only to meet soon after a mounted knight. His steed was well armoured, but he even more so. He wore a garment of gold, a bow was slung across his shoulders, and a sword hung from his side. The horse he rode was faster than the girl, moving with the speed of lightning on both air and ground. When the knight came upon the monk, He asked if he had seen a girl matching the description of the strange girl he had met earlier. The monk claimed he had seen no one of the sort. The knight saw through this lie immediately. He explained to the monk that the girl he had seen before was not a girl at all, but a flying ogre, one of thousands of varieties, who brought naught but destruction and ruin to people. This knight had slain a countless number, but this one was the worst he had found. The Lord of the Heavens themselves gave a triple command to 8,000 knights to scatter in all directions to find this monster. The knight stated that to not tell the truth would be a sin against heaven itself. Confronted with all this, the old monk capitulated, not daring to deceive the knight and anger the heavens. He could not utter anything faced with this, and merely pointed at the hollow. The messenger of heaven dismounted and stepped into the tree. After looking about him for a moment, the knight quickly returned to his horse, mounted it, and rode into the hollow. The monk looked up to see a small red flame emerge from the top of the tree, and swiftly following just behind was the messenger of heaven. Both rose and disappeared in the clouds high above. The monk stood bewildered. After a time there fell a rain, red as scarlet. Blood rained from the heavens above. In the ancient Chinese provinces near Shantung was a merchant who travelled along the road from the south to sell his wares. On a particular night, a heavy storm blew in from the north, making travel and sleep quite impossible. The merchant was relieved to chance upon an inn on the side of the road, whose lights were just flickering into existence, emanating a welcoming glow. He left the wind and rain behind him as he crossed the threshold. The inn seemed quite full, and he weaved his way through the throngs of people to reach the counter where he asked for food, drink, and lodging for the night. At this, a sudden uproar came from the people in the inn who objected to this newcomer. Yet thankfully an old man took pity on the merchant, and said they had no food or wine left, for they had given them all to the soldiers which filled the inn. However, there was a little room left unoccupied that the merchant could stay in free for one night. The old man led the merchant to the room, which was indeed quite small, but he took it gratefully. The merchant tried to sleep, but a rumbling belly and parched throat made sleep quite difficult. Outside he heard the noises of men and horses, but something strange caught the merchant's ear. He couldn't quite place what it was, but something didn't seem quite right, so he got up and peeked through a thin gap in the door. In the main area of the inn, he saw several soldiers talking boisterously amongst themselves about past campaigns he had never heard of, and taking in great amounts of food and drink. After watching for a while, the merchant heard a shout, declaring that the general was coming, and far off in the distance could be heard the shouts of his bodyguards. All the soldiers hurried outside to receive the general. The merchant peered out a little further to see a procession with many paper lanterns, and riding tall amongst them, a man of great stature and appearance, with a long beard. The long-bearded general dismounted and entered the inn, taking his place at the head of the board. The soldiers stood guard at the door, awaiting command while the innkeeper served food and drink to the newly arrived general. He downed all the innkeeper brought like a man starved. Once he finished, he dismissed his officers, claiming he wished to rest before the assembly gave the order to advance. The officers nodded and withdrew. The general then cried out for someone called Asti, and in came a young officer from the left side of the house. The people of the inn locked all the gates and withdrew for the night, while Asti conducted the general to a door on the left, where a sliver of lamplight fell through. The merchant, finding this all very curious, followed after to look through a crack in the door. Within the room was a bed of bamboo, with no covers or pillows, and a lamp that sat on the ground. Suddenly, to the merchant's horror, the general placed his hands on the sides of his head, and lifted it off his neck. He gently placed his dismembered head on the bed, and raised his arms. Asti took hold of the arms and took them off in the same fashion, placing them on the bed beside the head. The long-bearded general lay down on the bed crosswise, and Asti now took hold of his body. Asti easily separated the torso from the thighs, and the general's 2 legs fell to the ground with a thud that blew out the lamplight. Overcome by fear, the merchant hurried back to his room, covering his eyes with his sleeve so he should not see any new horrors. He threw himself into his bed and tried to sleep, but he tossed about and struggled till morning. Finally he heard a cock crow in the distance, and only then did he remove his sleeves from his eyes. He shook with the cold as he was encircled by the wilderness, with not a house in sight, only thick clumps of brush. The inn was nowhere to be seen. Despite the chill of the dawn, the merchant ran about 3 miles to the nearest inn. The innkeeper opened the door to find the distraught merchant on the threshold. The innkeeper asked the merchant where he had come from at such an early hour. The merchant burst forth with a tale of all he had experienced last night. The innkeeper seemed perplexed and shook his head. He told the merchant the area around was once a place of many battlefields, and at night the wilderness was a place for all manner of supernatural things.